It's no secret that Magnus Carlsen is the best chess player in the world. But how much room actually separates Magnus from the rest of the top players in the game? Well, today we're going to look at some of the moves that helped Magnus achieve a near perfect score against 7 of the top grandmasters in the world. They're all super grandmasters above 2700 FIDE rating. This was in the Meltwaters Champions Chess Tour finals. And when I say near perfect score, you get different points depending on if you win before tiebreaks in the 4 rapid game match. And Magnus Carlsen only needed tiebreaks 1 time, and that was against Kwang Liam, and of course Magnus won that as well. Without further ado, let's look at some of these crushing Magnus moves. In round 2, Magnus Carlsen was playing against Arjun Erigaisi, who is a up-and-coming Indian prodigy, absolute superstar. Fabiano Caruana recently said that he thinks that Arjun Erigaisi is the most likely to reach 2800 in sometime in his career out of all the Indian prodigies. But that did not stop Magnus from converting like a boss. Only move, rook b1. That's very natural because what you're trying to do is help this pawn promote. So for example, you can't just take the pawn because then you lose a rook. But also white can't take the rook because then you promote and they're pretty much forced to take that and you're just up too much material. So instead, Arjun tried to kick out the bishop. But the issue is that Magnus knows exactly where to place it. He disconnects white's 2 rooks. And when you think about rooks, they're most powerful when they're connected, right? That's one of the first things you learn as a beginner is that you know, when you're developing your pieces, at the end of the day, you want your rooks to be connected usually. But this basically isolates the defense of the c1 rook and it's completely hanging. Arjun tries for taking the pawn, but then he's like, a few moves later, okay, I don't want to play the rest of this game down a rook, and Arjun resigned. So the first move, bishop d1, is kind of just a little bit of a warm-up, but still just a very clean conversion here. Next up, we have Magnus Carlsen versus Shakhriyar Mamedyarov, and Mamedyarov is a seasoned veteran, okay? But Magnus is up 2-0 in the match already, so Mamedyarov has to play some crazy aggressive chess to try and force 2 wins. So he's looking for imbalances. He strikes out with g5. I'm just going to fast forward through the rest of this game until we get to a critical moment. But basically, Mamedyarov is under so much pressure because he's like, I'm playing Magnus and I need to do something to win. I can't just go and play something boring for a draw. And eventually, Magnus goes and hits the queen. Mamedyarov is trying to play actively, so he puts it on an active square on e5. But here's the move. Magnus finds f4. And what f4 does is it traps the queen. You cannot go backwards because you are blocked by your own pieces. These pawns control these squares. The rook's covering this. The pawn and knights are covering these 2 squares, right? So everything is controlled, and black tries to get fancy because they're going to say, I have this Zwischenzug where I can try and take your queen after you take my queen. But the issue with that, the reigning world champion knows that if he takes the queen with a pawn and his queen is taking with a knight, he knows, and actually Mamedyarov knows as well because he resigned after he took the queen. I guess he knew that Magnus knew that he knew that he knew that he would know that you lose a knight versus the pawn, and all of a sudden Magnus is just up a clean piece for 2 pawns. Instead of trying to hold this miserable position, Mamedyarov just said enough's enough, and again, he resigned right after he took the queen. So just to clarify, Magnus completely blanked Shakhriyar Mamedyarov with 3 wins and 0 losses, 0 draws. On to round 4, where Magnus Carlsen is playing against Anish Giri, and this is the 3rd game. Again, Magnus Carlsen is up 2-0 already. So what is Magnus doing? He just needs to draw, right? He's like, let's trade the queens off, which this looks weird in and of itself, right? If you trade queens, black's pawn structure is just, I guess, it's isolated, but the rooks are very active, and these 2 pawns are preventing white from making any progress with their pawns. But like I said, Magnus only needs a draw, and Anish needs to win for the match to continue. So he goes for queen b4, and this is an issue because now Magnus is able to secure a rook on the 2nd rank, right? If you get a rook on the 2nd rank or the 7th rank, if you're playing with white, typically your rooks on that rank are super powerful because they laser everything. They limit your opponent's activity. Anish strikes back with a4, but he's actually missing the whole point of what rook c2 is doing. And Magnus uncorks a brilliant sacrifice, knight takes g3. What's the idea? Well, like I said, the rook's on the 2nd rank, it's super powerful, and now that the knight has jumped off of the f file, well, both rooks see the f2 square. So if you take my bishop, then I will come in this way, and if you take my knight with the f pawn, Well, I still go to f2, and, you know, if you take my bishop now, then it's just mate immediately. So, what do? Well, Anish tries to take the bishop and goes from here. Unfortunately, like I said, the rook ends up on f2 anyway, and after knight e2, there is a crazy, ridiculous mate in 9. It involves a lot of, like, discovered threats and stuff like that, but Magnus being very practical in a rapid game, right? If it was classical, maybe Magnus would take the time off his clock and figure out the mate in 9, try and force his way through, but instead, Magnus is very practical. He decides to trade everything off, and now if you look at it, it's completely winning. He's up 2 pawns. How do you convert? Well, he converts by forcing a trade to the rooks. Anish is like, no, I can't just trade materials, so let's try to keep as much on the board as possible. But the issue is that when Magnus takes, and Anish takes, queen c1, and Anish resigns. Look at the way that Magnus sacrificed 2 different pieces. I mean, 2 pieces are hanging right now, right? And that ends up with him breaking through and ending up 2 pawns, which allowed him to just convert in the cleanest way possible, pinning pieces to the king, basically eliminating every single little bit of counterplay left, and that is just world class right there. So just to recap so far, Magnus has taken down Wesley So in 3 games out of the 4-game match. He's taken down Arjun Erigaisi in only 3 games. He's taken down Shankar Mamedyarov in 3 games. And now he's taken down Anish Giri in 3 games only. So he's played 4 different matches that are supposed to be 4-game matches, and he's never had to play the 4th game yet. That's just completely wild. Now, in the 5th round, he did play Lequang Liem, and as I mentioned before, that's the one guy that pushed him to tiebreaks, and Magnus eventually won that. But then we get to round 6, where another young Indian prodigy is playing against Magnus, and this is Pragg R, who has defeated Magnus in rapid multiple times in the past. And here, Black has a slight advantage, but Pragg's trying to figure out a way to break through. His queen is basically giving all these checks, but you have to be careful. Where do you give the checks so that you don't fumble into a draw or even worse? And after queen b1, Magnus moves out of the way, and Pragg tries to make progress by taking on d5. And this is where, when you give Magnus just a little bit of opportunity, he will come crashing through. Because the only way to win is by going off into an endgame, and by giving this check and this check, he is effectively forking Pragg's king and queen. Of course, he's forking it with his queen, so it's not like he's winning material, but he's forcing a trade of material. And this converts to a winning endgame. And you might be wondering why. Pragg is up a pawn. How is this winning for white instead of black? I mean, black's got the passed pawn, so how do you see the conversion? Well, Magnus sacrifices the b pawn. Now he's down 2 pawns, right? But the issue is that now you sacrifice the b pawn so that your a pawn can get stronger and become a pass pawn. And if you look at the board, a pawn versus knight, they are as far away as possible from each other right now. So the knight starts trying to catch the pawn, and of course, it is just in time, because now it can block the promotion square. But Magnus has effectively assigned that black knight to only defend the promotion of the a pawn. And that allows the king to activate and start grabbing pawns itself. And now Magnus comes over to threaten the knight. And he could just take on a8, but the issue is that like king c8 looks a little bit dicey, because your king is forever blocked from getting out and allowing the a pawn to promote. The computer says it's completely fine. You just go and start galloping and taking all these pawns one by one, because the black king is assigned to protecting that corner, right? So it should be fine, but Magnus decides to play it a little bit safer, just from a practical human standpoint, and he just activates the king. And I mean, literally just a bunch of moves later, he even drops the a pawn, I believe, but he has a new passed pawn at this point, and it's not a big deal. Okay, and several moves later, he's just coming through, constantly sacrificing his knight, and now it's finally at a point where since this knight hasn't been taken, it's protecting the 1 square, because if this knight wasn't here, I'm pretty sure this would be a draw. The knight just constantly windmills around the king, but since the knight is still here, it prevents that windmill of checks. So just to recap that one more time, Magnus was worse in this position, but just a couple of moves later where Pragg doesn't keep checking, allows Magnus to come through and convert to a winning endgame after Pragg makes one tiny mistake. And the final sequence of moves I want to show you is from the last round where Magnus Carlsen played against Jan Krzysztof Duda, the Polish Grandmaster. And in this position, it looks a little bit scary because White's got this pin on the G-pawn. The Queen and the Rook are both on the H-file with this huge battery, but this battery is actually the weakness of White. You might be like, wait, I thought batteries were good. Batteries and pins, like it all looks great, right? But first off, the G-pawn's pretty well defended. Secondly, Magnus finds the most ridiculous. Queen takes H3. What? Well, the issue is that, okay, Queen takes Queen, right? Rook H8, and your Queen's pinned, so you might as well take. Okay, take. And now look at the structure. You have Rook versus Bishop. Okay, White's up in exchange, but they're down like 4 extra pawns on top of that. And that is just not enough for White to hold this. You know, Black can even drop pawns, but at the end of the day, you're thinking, okay, there's 3 passed pawns. How can there be any world where White draws? Well, in this position, you or I would probably draw or lose this against Duda at least. But yeah, the only winning move is E2. If you do anything else, apparently this king is going to be able to get enough of the pawns and stop the last remaining one. I mean, at some point, it'll probably sacrifice the rook for the bishop or for a pawn. Either way, Magnus does find E2, and then he finishes in complete style because he pushes the pawn, and then he pushes the pawn again. Now Duda pulls his final card. He tries to sacrifice the rook for one of the passed pawns, one square away from promotion. And when the bishop takes, he's like, oh yes, look at this. I am in the square. I'm going to stop this pawn, and you can't checkmate me with a bishop. What are you going to do, Magnus? Well, Magnus is like, bishop d1 check. Because if you take that, you are no longer in the square, and this pawn will promote. Another way, if you try and protect the passed pawn, then bishop f3, this king just waltzes forward, and we are going to promote anyway. Magnus Carlsen just absolutely in style, relentless, ruthless, destroying everybody. Literally, he only had to play more than 3 games in the 4-game match format 2 times. Once against Lequang Liem, who took him to tiebreakers, and another time against Jan Krzysztof Duda. The man is beyond a super GM. He is Magnus Carlsen. If you enjoyed this video, then hopefully you will also enjoy this video that the algorithm picked for you. Hope you enjoyed. Happy learning, everyone.